This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 1. Notice to the second edition. The first edition of these tales being exhausted, and a demand having arisen for a second, the translator has thought it right to add 13 tales, which complete the translation of Asbjornsen and Moe's collection, and to strengthen the introduction by working in some new matter, and by working out some points which were only slightly sketched in the first edition. The favor with which the book was welcomed makes it almost a duty to say a word here on the many kind and able notices which have been written upon it. Duties are not always pleasant, but the fulfillment of this at least gives no pain, because, without one exception, every criticism which the translator has seen has shown him that his prayer for gentle readers has been fully heard. It will be forgiven him, he hopes, when he says that he has not seen good ground to change or even to modify any of the opinions as to the origin and diffusion of popular tales put forth in the first edition. Much indeed has been said by others for those views. What has been urged against them, with all kindness and good humor, in one or two cases, has not availed at all to weigh down mature convictions deliberately expressed after the studies of years, backed as they are by the researchers and support of those who have given their lives to this branch of knowledge. And now, before the translator takes leave of his readers for the second time, he will follow the lead of the good godmother in one of these tales, and forbid all good children to read the two which stand last in the book. There is this difference between him and the godmother. She found her foster daughter out as soon as she came back. He will never know it, if any bad child has broken his behest. Still, he hopes that all good children who read this book will bear in mind that there is just as much sin in breaking a commandment, even though it be not found out, and so he bids them good-bye, and feels sure that no good child will dare to look into those two rooms. If after this warning they peep in, they may perhaps see something which will shock them. Why then print them all? Some grown readers ask. Because this volume is meant for you as well as for children. And if you have gone ever so little into the world with open eyes, if you must have seen, yes, every day, things much more shocking, because there is nothing immortal in their spirit, because they are intrinsically valuable, as illustrating manners and traditions, and so could not well be left out, because they complete the number of the Norse originals, and leave none untranslated. At last, though not least, because the translator hates family versions of anything, family Bibles, family Shakespeares. Those who, with so large a choice of beauty before them, would pick out and gloat over this or that coarseness or freedom of expression, are like those who, in reading the Bible, should always turn to Leviticus, or those whose Shakespeare would open of itself at Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Such readers the translator does not wish to have. End of section 1.
Section 2 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Vera Neal. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 2. Notice to the first edition. These translations from Norse Folkeeventyr, collected with such freshness and faithfulness by M.M. Asbjornsen and Moe, have been made at various times and at long intervals during the last 15 years, a fact which is mentioned only to account for any variations in style or tone, of which, however, the translator is unconscious, that a critical eye may detect in this volume. One of them, The Master Thief, has already appeared in Blackwood's magazine for November 1851, from the columns of which periodical it is now reprinted by the kind permission of the proprietors. The translator is sorry that he has not been able to comply with the suggestion of some friends upon whose goodwill he sets all store, who wished him to change and soften some features in these tales, which they thought likely to shock English feeling. He has, however, felt it to be out of his power to meet their wishes, for the merit of an undertaking of this kind rests entirely on its faithfulness and truth. And the man who, in such a work, wilfully changes or softens, is as guilty as he who puts bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Of this guilt, at least, the translator feels himself free, and, perhaps, if any, who may be inclined to be offended at first, will take the trouble to read the introduction which precedes and explains the tales, they may find not only that the softening process would have sparked these popular traditions for all except the most childish readers, but that the things which shock them at the first blush are, after all, not so very shocking. For the rest, it ill becomes him to speak of the way in which his work has been done, but if the reader will only bear in mind that this, too, is an enchanted garden, in which whoever dares to pluck a flower, does it at the peril of his head, and if he will then read the book in a merciful and tender spirit, he will prove himself what the translator most longs to find, a gentle reader, and both will part on the best terms. End of section 2.
Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 3, Introduction, Part 1, Origin. The most careless reader can hardly fail to see that many of the tales in this volume have the same groundwork as those with which he has been familiar from his earliest youth. They are nursery tales, in fact, of the days when there were tales in nurseries, old wives' fables, which have faded away before the light of gas and the power of steam. It is long, indeed, since English nurses told these tales to English children by force of memory and word of mouth. In a written shape, we have long had some of them, at least, in English versions of the Conte de la Mère L'Oye of Perrault, and the Conte des Fées of Madame d'Aulnoy, those tight-laced, high-heeled tales of the teacup times of Louis XIV and his successors, in which the popular tale appears to as much disadvantage as an artless country girl in the stifling atmosphere of a London theatre. From these foreign sources, after the voice of the English reciter was hushed, and it was hushed in England more than a century ago, our great-grandmothers learnt to tell of Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast, of Little Red Riding Hood and Bluebeard, mingled together in the Cabinet des Fées, with Sinbad the Sailor and Aladdin's wondrous lamp; for that was an uncritical age, and its spirit breathed hot and cold, east and west, from all quarters of the globe at once, confusing the traditions and tales of all times and countries into one incongruous mass of fable, as much tangled and knotted as that famous pound of flax which the lassie in one of these tales is expected to spin into an even wool within 24 hours. No poverty of invention or want of power on the part of translators could entirely destroy the innate beauty of these popular traditions, but here, in England at least, they had almost dwindled out, or at any rate had been lost sight of as home growths. We had learnt to buy our own children back, disguised in foreign garb; and as for their being anything more than the mere pastime of an idle hour, as to their having any history or science of their own, such an absurdity was never once thought of. It had, indeed, been remarked, even in the 18th century, that dreary time of indifference and doubt, that some of the popular traditions of the nations north of the Alps contained striking resemblances and parallels to stories in the classical mythology. But those were the days when Greek and Latin lorded it over the other languages of the earth, and when any such resemblance or analogy was observed, it was commonly supposed that that base-born slave, the vulgar tongue, had dared to make a clumsy copy of something peculiarly belonging to the twin tyrants who ruled all the dialects of the world with a pedant's rod. At last, just at the close of that great war which Western Europe waged against the genius and fortune of the first Napoleon, Just as the eagle, Prometheus and the eagle in one shape, was fast fettered by sheer force and strength to his rock in the Atlantic, there arose a man in central Germany, on the old Thuringian soil, to whom it was given to assert the dignity of vernacular literature, to throw off the yoke of classical tyranny, and to claim for all the dialects of Teutonic speech a right of ancient inheritance and perfect freedom, before unsuspected and unknown. It is almost needless to mention this honored name. For the furtherance of the good work which he began nearly 50 years ago, he still lives and still labors. There is no spot on which an accent of Teutonic speech is uttered where the name of Jacob Grimm is not a household word. His General Grammar of all the Teutonic dialects from Iceland to England has proved the equality of these tongues with their ancient classical oppressors. His Antiquities of Teutonic Law have shown that the codes of the Lombards, Franks, and Goths were not mere savage, brutal customaries, based, as had been supposed, on the absence of all law and right. His numerous treatises on early German authors have shown that the German poets of the Middle Age, Godfrey of Strasbourg, Wolfram von Eschenbach, Hartmann von der Au, Walter von der Vogelweide, and the rest, can hold their own against any contemporary writers in other lands. And lastly, what rather concerns us here, his Teutonic mythology, his Reynard the Fox, and the collection of German popular tales, which he and his brother William published, have thrown a flood of light on the early history of all the branches of our race, and have raised what had come to be looked on as mere nursery fictions and old wives' fables, to a study fit for the energies of grown men, and to all the dignity of a science. In these pages, where we have to run over a vast tract of space, the reader who wishes to learn and not to cavil, and for such alone this introduction is intended, must be content with results rather than processes and steps. To use a homely likeness, he must be satisfied with the soup that is set before him, and not desire to see the bones of the ox out of which it has been boiled. When we say, therefore, that in these latter days the philology and mythology of the East and West have met and kissed each other, that they now go hand in hand, that they lend one another mutual support, that one cannot be understood without the other, we look to be believed. We do not expect to be put to the proof, how the labors of Grimm and his disciples on this side were first rendered possible by the linguistic discoveries of Anquetil du Perron and others in India and France, at the end of the last century, then materially assisted and furthered by the researches of Sir William Jones, Colebrooke, and others, in India and England during the early part of this century, and finally have become identical with those of Wilson, Bopp, Lassen, and Max Müller, at the present day. The affinity which exists in a mythological and philological point of view between the Aryan or Indo-European languages on the one hand, and the Sanskrit on the other, is now the first article of a literary creed, and the man who denies it puts himself as much beyond the pale of argument as he who, in a religious discussion, should meet a grave divine of the Church of England with the strict contradictory of her first article, and loudly declare his conviction that there was no God. In a general way, then, we may be permitted to dogmatize, and to lay it down as a law which is always in force, that the first authentic history of a nation is the history of its tongue. We can form no notion of the literature of a country apart from its language, and the consideration of its language necessarily involves the consideration of its history. Here is England, for instance, with a language, and therefore a literature, composed of Celtic, Roman, Saxon, Norse, and Romance elements. Is not this simple fact suggestive of, nay, does it not challenge us to, an inquiry into the origin and history of the races who have passed over our island, and left their mark not only on the soil but on our speech? Again, to take a wider view, and to rise from archaeology to science, what problem has interested the world in a greater degree than the origin of man, and what toil has not been spent in tracing all races back to their common stock? The science of comparative philology, the inquiry, not into one isolated language, for nowadays it may fairly be said of a man who knows only one language that he knows none, but into all the languages of one family, and thus to reduce them to one common center, from which they spread like rays of the sun, if it has not solved, is in a fair way of solving, this problem. When we have done for the various members of each family what has been done of late years for the Indo-European tongues, its solution will be complete. In such an inquiry the history of a race is, in fact, the history of its language, and can be nothing else; for we have to deal with times antecedent to all history, properly so called, and the stream which in later ages may be divided into many branches, now flows in a single channel. From the East, then, came our ancestors, in days of immemorial antiquity, in that grey dawn of time of which all early songs and lays can tell, but of which it is as impossible as it is useless to attempt to fix the date; impossible, because no means exist for ascertaining it; useless, because it is in reality a matter of utter indifference, when, as this tell-tale crust of earth informs us, we have an infinity of ages and periods to fall back on, whether this great movement, this mighty lust to change their seats, seized on the Aryan race 100 or 1000 years sooner or later. But from the East we came, and from that central plain of Asia, now commonly called Iran. Iran, the habitation of the tillers and earers of the earth, as opposed to Turan, the abode of restless horse-riding nomads. Of Turks, in short, for in their name the root survives, and still distinguishes the great Turanian or Mongolian family from the Aryan, Iranian, or Indo-European race. It is scarce worth while to inquire, even if inquiry could lead to any result, what cause set them in motion from their ancient seats. Whether impelled by famine or internal strife, starved out like other nationalities in recent times, or led on by adventurous chiefs, whose spirits chafed at the narrowness of home, certain it is that they left that home and began a wandering westwards, which only ceased when it reached the Atlantic and the Northern Ocean. Nor was the fate of those they left behind less strange. At some period almost as remote as, but after, that at which the wanderers for Europe started, the remaining portion of the stock, or a considerable offshoot from it, turned their faces east, and passing the Indian Caucasus, poured through the defiles of Afghanistan, crossed the plain of the 5 rivers, and descended on the fruitful plains of India. The different destiny of these stocks has been wonderful indeed. Of those who went west, we have only to enumerate the names under which they appear in history: Celts, Greeks, Romans, Teutons, Slavonians, to see and to know at once that the stream of this migration has borne on its waves all that has become most precious to man. To use the words of Max Müller, they have been the prominent actors in the great drama of history, and have carried to their fullest growth all the elements of active life with which our nature is endowed. They have perfected society and morals, and we learn from their literature and works of art the elements of science, the laws of art, and the principles of philosophy. In continual struggle with each other and with Semitic and Mongolian races, these Aryan nations have become the rulers of history, and it seems to be their mission to link all parts of the world together by the chains of civilization, commerce, and religion. We may add that though by nature tough and enduring, they have not been obstinate and self-willed. They have been distinguished from all other nations, and particularly from their elder brothers whom they left behind, by their common sense, by their power of adapting themselves to all circumstances, and by making the best of their position. Above all, they have been teachable, ready to receive impressions from without, and, when received, to develop them. To show the truth of this, we need only observe that they adopted Christianity from another race, the most obstinate and stiff-necked the world has ever seen, who, trained under the old dispensation to preserve the worship of the one true God, were too proud to accept the further revelation of God under the new, and rejecting their birthright, suffered their inheritance to pass into other hands. Such, then, has been the lot of the western branch, or of the younger brother, who, like the younger brother whom we shall meet so often in these popular tales, went out into the world, with nothing but his good heart and God's blessing to guide him, and now has come to all honor and fortune, and to be a king, ruling over the world. He went out and did. Let us see now what became of the elder brother, who stayed at home some time after his brother went out, and then only made a short journey. Having driven out the few aboriginal inhabitants of India with little effort, and following the course of the great rivers, the eastern Aryans gradually established themselves all over the peninsula, and then, in calm possession of a world of their own, undisturbed by conquest from without, and accepting with apathy any change of dynasty among their rulers, ignorant of the past and careless of the future, they sat down once for all and thought not of what they had to do here, that stern lesson of everyday life which neither man nor nations can escape if they are to live with their fellows, but how they could abstract themselves entirely from their present existence, and immerse themselves wholly in dreamy speculations on the future. Whatever they might have been during their short migration and subsequent settlement, it is certain that they appear in the Vedas, perhaps the earliest collection which the world possesses, as a nation of philosophers. Well may Professor Müller compare the Indian mind to a plant reared in a hothouse, gorgeous in color, rich in perfume, precocious and abundant in fruit. It may be all this, but it will never be like the oak, growing in wind and weather, striking its roots into real earth, and stretching its branches into real air, beneath the stars and sun of heaven. And well does he also remark, that a people of this peculiar stamp was never destined to act a prominent part in the history of the world; nay, the exhausting atmosphere of transcendental ideas could not but exercise a detrimental influence on the active and moral character of the Hindus. In this passive, abstract, unprogressive state they have remained ever since. Stiffened into castes, and tongue-tied and hand-tied by absurd rites and ceremonies, they were heard of in dim legends by Herodotus; they were seen by Alexander when that bold spirit pushed his phalanx beyond the limits of the known world; they trafficked with imperial Rome and the later empire; they were again almost lost sight of, and became fabulous in the Middle Age; they were rediscovered by the Portuguese; they have been alternately peaceful subjects and desperate rebels to us English; but they have been still the same immovable and unprogressive philosophers, though akin to Europe all the while, and though the Highlander, who drives his bayonet through the heart of a high-caste sepoy mutineer, little knows that his pale features and sandy hair, and that dusk face with its raven locks, both come from a common ancestor away in Central Asia many, many centuries ago. But here arises the question, what interest can we, the descendants of the practical brother, heirs to so much historical renown, possibly take in the records of a race so historically characterless, and so sunk in reveries and mysticism? The answer is easy. Those records are written in a language closely allied to the primeval common tongue of those two branches before they parted, and descending from a period anterior to their separation. It may, or it may not, be the very tongue itself, but it certainly is not further removed than a few steps. The speech of the emigrants to the West rapidly changed with the changing circumstances and various fortune of each of its waves, and in their intercourse with the aboriginal population they often adopted foreign elements into their language. One of these waves, it is probable, passing by way of Persia and Asia Minor, crossed the Hellespont, and following the coast, threw off a mighty rill, known in after times as Greeks; while the main stream, striking through Macedonia, either crossed the Adriatic, or still hugging the coast, came down on Italy, to be known as Latins; another, passing between the Caspian and the Black Sea, filled the steppes around the Crimea; and, passing on over the Balkan and the Carpathians towards the west, became the great Teutonic nationality which, under various names, but all closely akin, filled, when we first hear of them in historical times, the space between the Black Sea and the Baltic, and was then slowly but surely driving before them the great wave of the Celts which had preceded them in their wandering, and which had probably followed the same line of march as the ancestors of the Greeks and Latins. A movement which lasted until all that was left of Celtic nationality was either absorbed by the intruders, or forced aside and driven to take refuge in mountain fastnesses and outlying islands. Besides all these, there was still another wave, which is supposed to have passed between the Sea of Aral and the Caspian, and, keeping still further to the north and east, to have passed between its kindred Teutons and the Mongolian tribes, and so to have lain in the background until we find them appearing as Slavonians in the scene of history. Into so many great stocks did the western Aryans pass, each possessing strongly marked nationalities and languages, and these seemingly so distinct that each often asserted that the other spoke a barbarous tongue. But, for all that, Each of those tongues bears about with it still, and in earlier times no doubt bore still more plainly about with it, infallible evidence of common origin, so that each dialect can be traced up to that primeval form of speech still in the main preserved by the Sanskrit by the southern Aryan branch, who, careless of practical life and immersed in speculation, have clung to their ancient traditions and tongue with wonderful tenacity. It is this which has given such value to Sanskrit, a tongue of which it may be said that if it had perished the sun would never have risen on the science of comparative philology. Before the discoveries in Sanskrit of Sir William Jones, Wilkins, Wilson, and others, the world had striven to find the common ancestor of European languages, sometimes in the classical and sometimes in the Semitic tongues. In the one case the result was a tyranny of Greek and Latin over the non-classical tongues, and in the other the most uncritical and unphilosophical waste of learning. No doubt some striking analogies exist between the Indo-European family and the Semitic stock, just as there are remarkable analogies between the Mongolian and Indo-European families. But the ravings of Vallancey in his effort to connect the Erse with Phoenician are an awful warning of what unscientific inquiry, based on casual analogy, may bring itself to believe and even to fancy it has proved. These general observations, then, and this rapid bird's-eye view, may suffice to show the common affinity which exists between the Eastern and Western Aryans, between the Hindoo on the one hand, and the nations of Western Europe on the other. That is the fact to keep steadily before our eyes. We all came, Greek, Latin, Celt, Teuton, Slavonian, from the East, as kith and kin, leaving kith and kin behind us; and after thousands of years the language and traditions of those who went East and those who went West bear such an affinity to each other as to have established, beyond discussion or dispute, the fact of their descent from a common stock. End of Section 3.
Of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Yu. Popular Tales from the Norse by George Dasent. Section 4. Introduction. Part 2. Diffusion. This general affinity established, we proceed to narrow our subject to its proper limits, and to confine it to the consideration, first, of popular tales in general, and secondly, of those Norse tales in particular which form the bulk of this volume. In the first place, then, the fact which we remarked of setting out that the groundwork or plot of many of these tales is common to all the nations of Europe is more important and of greater scientific interest than might at first appear. They form, in fact, another link in the chain of evidence of a common origin between the East and the West, and even the obstinate adherents of the old classical theory, according to which all resemblances were set down to sheer copying from Greek or Latin patterns, are now forced to confess not only that there was no such wholesale copying at all, but that, in many cases, the despised vernacular tongues have preserved the common traditions far more faithfully than the writers of Greece and Rome. The sooner, in short, that this theory of copying, which some, even besides the classicists, have maintained, is abandoned, the better, not only for the truth, but for the literary reputation of those who put it forth. No one can, of course, imagine that during that long succession of ages when this mighty wedge of Aryan migration was driving its way through that prehistoric race, that nameless nationality, the traces of which we everywhere find underlying the intruders in the monuments and implements of bone and stone, a race akin in all probability to the Mongolian family, and whose miserable remnants we see pushed aside and huddled up in the holes and the corners of Europe as Lapps and Finns and Basques. No one, we say, can suppose for a moment that in that long process of contact and absorption some traditions of earlier race should not have been caught up and adopted by the other. We know it to be a fact with regard to their language from the evidence of philosophy, which cannot lie, and the witness borne by such a word as the Gothic Atta for father, where a Mongolian has been adopted in preference to an Aryan word, is irresistible on that point. But that, apart from such natural assimilation, all the thousand shades of resemblance and affinity which gleam and flicker through the whole body of popular tradition in the Aryan race, as the aurora plays and flashes in countless ways athwart the northern heaven, should be the result of mere servile copying of one tribe's tradition by another, is a supposition as absurd as that of those good country folk who, when they see an aurora, fancy it must be a great fire, the work of some incendiary, and send off the parish engine to put it out. Not when we find in such a story as the master thief traits, which are to be found in the Sanskrit Hitopadesa, and which reminds us at once of the story of Rhampsinitus in Herodotus, which are also to be found in German, Italian, and Flemish popular tales, but told in all with such a variation of character and detail, and such adaptations to time and place, as evidently show the original working of the national consciousness upon a stock of tradition common to all the race, but belonging to no tribe of that race in particular. And when we find this occurring not in one tale but in 20, we are forced to abandon the theory of such universal copying for fear lest we should fall into a greater difficulty than that for which we were striving to account. To set this question in a plainer light, let us take a well-known instance. Let us take the story of William Tell and his daring shot, which is said to have been made in the year 1307. It is just possible that the feat might be historical, and no doubt thousands believe it for the sake of the Swiss patriot, as firmly as they believe in anything. But unfortunately, this story of the bold archer who saves his life by shooting an apple from the head of his child at the command of a tyrant is common to the whole Aryan race. It appears in Saxo Grammaticus, who flourished in the 12th century, where it is told of Penatoki, King Harold Gormson's thane and assassin. In the 13th century, the Wilkina saga relates it of Egil Volund's Wayland Smith's younger brother, so also in the Norse saga of St. Olaf, king and martyr, the king, who died in 1030. Eager for the conversation of one of his heathen chiefs, Eindridi, competes with him in various athletic exercises, first in swimming and then in archery. After several famous shots on either side, the king challenges Eindridi to shoot a tablet off his son's head without hurting the child. Eindridi is ready, but declares he will revenge himself in the child if the child is hurt. The king has the first shot, and his arrow strikes close to the tablet. Then Eindridi is to shoot, but at the prayers of his mother and sister refuses the shot, and has to yield and be converted. So also King Harold Sigurdarson, who died in 1066, backed himself against a famous marksman, Hemingr, and ordered him to shoot a hazelnut off the heads of his brother Born, and Hemingr performed the feat. In the middle of the 14th century, the Malleus Maleficarum refers it to Puncher, a magician of the Upper Rhine. Here, in England, we have it in the Old English ballad of Adam Bell, Clym of the Clough, and William of Cloudesley, where William performs the feat. It is not at all of tale in Switzerland before the year 1499, and the earlier Swiss chronicles omit it altogether. It is common to the Turks and the Mongolians, and a legend of the wild Samoyeds, who never heard of tale or saw a book in their lives, relates it, chapter and verse, of one of their famous marksmen. What shall we say then, but the story of this bold master shot was primeval amongst many tribes and races, and that it only crystallized itself round the great name of tale by that process of attraction which invariably leads a grateful people to throw such mythic wreaths, such garlands of bold deeds of precious memory, found round the brow of its darting champion. Nor let any pious Welshman be shocked if we venture to assert that Gellert, the famous hound, upon whose last resting place the traveller comes as he passes down the lovely vale of Granant, is a mythical dog, and never snuffed the fresh breeze in the forest of Snowdon, nor saved his master's child from ravening wolf. This too is a primeval story, told with many variations. Sometimes the foe is a wolf, sometimes a bear, sometimes a snake, sometimes the faithful guardian of the child is an otter, a weasel, or a dog. It too came from the East. It is found in the Tantra, in the Hitopaedia, in Bidpar's Fables, in the Arabic original of the Seven Wise Masters, that famous collection of stories which illustrate a stepdame's calumny and hate, and in many medieval versions of those originals. Thence it passed into the Latin Gesta Romanorum, where, as well as in the Old English version, published by Sir Frederick Madden, it may be read as a service rendered by a faithful hound against a snake. This too, like Tell's master shot, is as the lightning which shineth over the whole heaven at once, and can be claimed by no one tribe of the Aryan race, to the exclusion of the rest. The dog of Montagus is in like manner mythic, though perhaps not so widely spread. It first occurs in France, as told of Sibylla, a fabulous wife of Charlemagne, but it is at any rate as old as the time of Plutarch, who relates it as an anecdote of brute sagacity in the days of Pythus. There can be no doubt, with regard to the question of the origin of these tales, that they were common in germ, at least to the Aryan tribes before their migration. We find those germs developed in the popular traditions of the Eastern Aryans, and we find them developed in 100 forms and shapes in every one of the nations into which the Western Aryans have shaped themselves in the course of ages. We are led, therefore, irresistibly to the conclusion that these traditions are as much a portion of the common inheritance of our ancestors as their language unquestionably is, and that they form, along with that language, a double chain of evidence, which proves their Eastern origin. If we are to seek for a simile or an analogy as to the relative positions of these tales and traditions, and to the mutual resemblances which exist between them as the several branches of our race have developed them from the common stock, we may find it in one which will come home to every reader as he looks round the domestic hearth, if he should be so happy as to have one. They are like as sisters of one house alike. They have what would be called a strong family likeness, but besides this likeness, which they owe to father or mother, as the case may be, they have each their peculiarities of form and eye and face, and still more their differences of intellect and mind. This may be dark, that fair; this may have grey eyes, that black; this may be open and graceful, that reserved and close; this you may love, and that you can take no interest in. One may be bashful, another winning, a third worth knowing and yet hard to know. They are so like and so unlike. At first it may be, as an old English writer beautifully expressed it, their father hath writ them as his own little story, but as they grow up they throw off the copy, educate themselves for good or ill, and finally assume new forms of feeling and feature under an original development of their own. Or shall we take another likeness and say they are national dreams, that they are like the sleeping thoughts of many men upon one and the same thing? Suppose 100 men to have been eye-witness of some event on the same day, and then to have slept and dreamed of it, we should have as many distinct representations of that event, all turning upon it and bound up with it in some way, but each preserving the personality of the sleeper and working up the common stuff in a higher or lower degree, just as the fancy and the intellect of the sleeper was at a higher or lower level of perfection. There is indeed greater truth in this likeness than may at first sight appear. In the popular tale, properly so called, the national mind dreams all its history over again. In its half-conscious state, it takes this trait and that trait, this feature and that feature, of times and ages long past. It snatches up bits of the old beliefs and fears and griefs and glory, and pieces them together with something that happened yesterday, and then holds up the discarded reflection in all its inconsequence, just as it has passed before that magic glass, as though it were genuine history and matter for pure belief. And here it may be as well to say that besides that old classical foe of vernacular tradition, there is another hardly less dangerous, which returns to the charge of copying, but changes what lawyers call the venue of the trial from classical to Eastern lands. According to this theory, which came up when its classical predecessor was no longer tenable, the traditions and tales of Western Europe came from the East, but they were still all copies. They were supposed to have proceeded entirely from two sources: one, the Directorium Hymnae Vitae of John of Capua, which again came from an Arabic version of the 8th century, which came from a Pahlavi version made by one Basuye at the command of Chosroe Noshivan, king of Persia in the 6th century, which again came from the Panchatantra, a Sanskrit original of unknown antiquity. This is that famous book of Kalila and Dimna, as the Persian version is called, attributed to Bidpai, and which was thus run to earth in India. The second source of Western tradition was held to be that still more famous collection of stories commonly known by the name of the Story of the Seven Sages, but which, under many names, Kaiser Octavianus, Diocletianus, Dolopathus, Erastus, etc., plays a most important part in medieval romance. This too, by a similar process, has been traced to India, appearing first in Europe at the beginning of the 13th century in the Latin Historia Septem Sapientum Romae by Dame Jahans, monk in the Abbey of Houtzelf. Here, too, we have a Hebrew, an Arabic, and a Persian version, which last came avowedly from a Sanskrit original, though that original has not yet been discovered. From these two sources of fable and tradition, according to the new copying theory, our Western fables and tales had come by direct translation from the East. Now it will be at once evident that this theory hangs on what may be called a single thread. Let us say then that all that can be found in Kalila and Dimna, or the later Persian version made A.D. 1494 of Hossein Weyers, called the Anvari Sohali, the Canopic Lights, from which, when published in Paris by David Said of Ispahan in the year 1644, La Fontaine drew the substance of many of his best fables. Let us say, too, that all can be found in the Life of the Seven Sages, or the Book of Sendabad, as it was called in Persia, after an apocryphal Indian sage came by translation, that is to say, through the cells of Brahmins, Magians, and monks, and the labours of the learned, into the popular literature of the West. Let us give up all that, and then see where we stand. What are we to say of the many tales and fables which are to be found in neither of those famous collections, and not tales alone, but traits and features of old tradition, broken bits of fable, roots and gems of mighty growths of song and story, nay, even the very words which exist in Western popular literature, and which modern philosophy has found obstinately sticking in Sanskrit, and of which fresh proofs and instances are discovered every day? What are we to say of such a remarkable resemblance as this? The noble King Patraka fled into the Vindhya mountains in order to live apart from his unkind kinsfolk, and as he wandered about there he met two men who wrestled and fought with one another. "Who are you?" he asked. "We are the sons of Mayasara, and here lie our riches, this bow, this staff, and these shoes. These are what we are fighting for, and whichever is stronger is to have them for his own." So when Petrarca had heard that, he asked them with a laugh, "Why, what's the good of owning these things?" Then they answered, "Whoever puts on these shoes gets the power to fly. Whatever is pointed at with this staff rises up at once, and whatever food one wishes for in this bowl, it comes at once." So when Petrarca had heard that, he said, "Why fight about it? Let this be the prize. Whoever beats the other in a race, let him have them all." "So be it," said the two fools, and set off running. But Petrarca put on the shoes at once, and flew away with the staff and bowl up into the clouds. Well, this is a story neither in the Tantra nor the Hitopadesa, the Sanskrit originals of Kalila and Dimna. It is not in the Directorum Humanae Vitae, and has not passed west by that way. Nor is it in the book of Sindbad, and thence come west in the history of the Seven Sages. Both these paths are stopped. It comes from the Katha Saint Sagara, the sea of streams of story of Samadeva Bhatta of Kashmir, who in the middle of the 12th century of our era worked up the tales found in an earlier collection called the Rika Katna, the lengthened story, in order to amuse his mistress, the Queen of Kashmir. Somadeva's collection has only been recently known and translated, but west the story certainly came long before, and in the extreme northwest we still find it in these Norse tales in the Three Princesses of Whiteland, number 26. "Well," said the man, "as this is so, I will give you a bit of advice. Hereabouts on a moor stand three brothers, and there they have stood these 100 years, fighting about a hat, a clock, and a pair of boots. If anyone has these three things, he can make himself invisible, and wish himself anywhere he pleases. You can tell them you wish to fly the things, and after that you'll pass judgment between them whose they shall be." Yes, the king thanked the man, and went and did as he told him. "What's all this?" he said to the brothers. "Why you stand fighting forever and a day? Just let me try these things, and I'll give judgment whose they shall be." They were very willing to do this, but as soon as he had got the hat, clock, and boots, he said, "When we meet next time, I'll tell you my judgment." And with these words he wished himself away. Nor in the Norse tales alone. Other collections showed how thoroughly at home this story was in the East. In the Relations of Sidi Kur, a Tartar tale, a Chan's son first gets possession of a clock which two children stand and fight for, which has the gift of making the wearer invisible, and afterwards of a pair of boots with which one can wish one's self to whatever place one chooses. Again, in a Wallachian tale, we read of three devils who fight for their inheritance: a club which turns everything to stone, a hat which makes the wearer invisible, and a clock by help of which one can wish one's self whichever one pleases. Again, in a Mongolian tale, the Chan's son comes upon a group of children who fight for a hood which makes the wearer invisible. He is to be judged between them, makes them run a race for it, but meanwhile puts it on and vanishes from their sight. A little further on he meets another group who are quarreling for a pair of boots, the wearer of which can wish himself whichever he pleases, and gains possession of them in the same way. Nor in one Norse tale alone, but in many, we find traces of these three wonderful things, or of things like them. They are very like the cloth, the ram, and the stick, which the lad got from the north wind instead of his meal. Very like, too, the cloth, the scissors, and the tap, which will be found in number 26. The best wish. If we drop the number 3, we find the boots again in Soria Maria Castle, number 61. Leaving the Norse tales, we see at once that they are the 7-league boots of Jack the Giant Killer. In the Nibelungen line, when Sigurd finds Shibung and Nibung, the weird heirs of the famous hoard, striving for the possession of that heap of red gold and gleaming stories, when they beg him to share it for them, promising them as his meed Ballemunk, best of swords. When he shares it, when they are discontent, and when, in the struggle which ensues, he gets possession of the Tanhut, the cloak of darkness, which gave its wearer the strength of 12 men, and enabled him to go where he would be unseen, and which was the great prize among the treasures of the dwarfs. Who is there that does not see the broken fragments of that old Eastern story of the heirs struggling for their inheritance, and calling in the aid of someone of better wit or strength, who ends by making the very prize for which they fight his own? And now to return for a moment to Kalila and Dimna and the 7 sages. Since we have seen that there are other stories, and many of them, for this is by no means the only resemblance to be found in Samnadeva's book, which are common to the Eastern and Western Aryans, but which did not travel to Europe by translation, let us go on to say that it is by no means certain, even when some Western stories or fable is found in these Sanskrit originals and their translations, that was the only way by which they came to Europe. A single question will prove this. How did the fables and epilogues, which are found in Aesop and which are also found in the Panchatanya and the Hitopadesha, come west? That they came from the east is certain, but by what way? Certainly not by translation or copying, for they had travelled west long before translations were thought of. How was it that Themistius, Greek orator of the 4th century, had heard of that fable of the lion, fox, and bull, which is in substance the same as that of the lion, the bull, and the 2 jackals in the Panchatanya and the Hitopadesha? How but along the path of that primitival Aryan migration, and by that deep ground tone of tradition by which man speaks to man, nation to nation, and age to age, along which comparative philosophy has, in these last days, travelled back thither, listened to the accents spoken, and so found the East the cradle of a common language and common belief. And now, having, as we hope, finally established this Indian affinity and disposed of mere Indian copying, let us lift our eyes and see if something more is not to be discerned on the wide horizon now open on our view. The most interesting problem for man to solve is the origin of his race. Of late years, comparative philosophy, having accomplished her task in proving the affinity of language between Europe and the East, and so taken a mighty step towards fixing the first seat of the greatest in wit and wisdom, if not in actual numbers, portion of the human race, has pursued her inquiries into the languages of the Turanian, the Semitic, and the Chamitic, or African races, with more or less successful results. In a few more years, when the African languages are better known, and the roots of Egyptian and Chinese words are more accurately detected, science will be better able to speak as to the common affinity of all the tribes that throng the earth. In the meantime, let the testimony of tradition and popular tales be heard, which in this case have outstripped comparative philosophy, and lead instead of following her. It is beyond the scope of this essay, which aims at being popular and readable rather than learned and lengthy, to go over a prolonged scientific investigation step by step. We repeat it. The reader must have faith in the writer and believe the words now written are the results of an inquiry, and not ask for the inquiry itself. In all mythologies and traditions, then, there are what may be called natural resemblances, parallelisms suggested to the senses of each race by natural objects and everyday events, and these might spring up spontaneously all over the earth as homegrowns, neither derived by imitation from other tribes nor from seeds of common tradition shed from a common stock. Such resemblances have been well compared by William Grimm to those words which are found in all languages, derived from the imitation of natural sounds, or, we may add, from the first lisping accents of infancy. But the case is very different when this or that object which strikes the senses is accounted for in a way so extraordinary and peculiar as to stamp the tradition with a character of its own. Then arises a like impression on the mind. If we find the same tradition in two tribes at the opposite ends of the earth, as is produced by meeting twin brothers, one in Africa and the other in Asia, we say at once, "I know you are so-and-so's brother, you are so like him." Take an instance in these Norse tales, number 23. We are told how it was the bear came to have a stumpy tail, and in an African tale we find how it was the hyena became tailless and earless. Now, this tailless condition, both of the bear and the hyena, could scarcely fail to attract attention in a race of hunters, and we might expect that popular tradition would attempt to account for both. But how are we to explain the fact that both Norsemen and African account of it in the same way, that both owe their laws to the superior cunning of another animal? In Europe, the fox bears away the palm for wit from all other animals. So he it is that persuades the bear in the Norse tales to sit with his tail in a hole in the ice till it is fast frozen in, and snaps short off when he tries to tuck it out. In Borneo, in the heart of Africa, it is the weasel who is the wisest of beasts, and who, having got some meat in common with the hyena, put it into a hole, and said, "Behold, 2 men came out of the forest, took the meat, and put it into the hole. Stop, I will go into the hole, and then thou mayst stretch out thy tail to me, and I will tie the meat to thy tail for thee to draw it out." So the weasel went into the hole. The hyena stretched its tail out to it, but the weasel took the hyena's tail, fastened a stick, and tied the hyena's tail to the stick, and then said to the hyena, "I have tied the meat to thy tail. Draw, and pull it out." The hyena was a fool. It did not know the weasel surpassed it in subtlety. It thought the meat was tied, but when it tried to draw out its tail, it was fast. When the weasel said again to it, "Pull," it pulled, but could not draw it out, so it became vexed, and on pulling with force, his tail broke. The tail being torn out, the weasel was no more seen by the hyena. The weasel was hidden in the hole with its meat, and the hyena saw it not. Here we have a fact in natural history account for, but account for in such a peculiar way as shows that the races among which we are current must have derived them from some common tradition. The mode by which the tail is lost is different indeed, but the manner in which the common groundwork is suited in one case to the cold of the north, and the way in which fish are commonly caught at holes in the ice as they rise to breathe, and in the other to Africa and her pitfalls for wild beasts, is only another proof of the oldness of the tradition, and that it is not merely a copy. Take another instance. Everyone knows the story in the Arabian Nights, where the man who knows the speech of beasts laughs at something said by an ox to an ass. His wife wants to know why he laughs, and persists, though he tells her it will cost him his life if he tells her. As he doubts what to do, he hears the cock said to the house dog, "Our master is not wise. I have 50 hens who obey me. If he followed my advice, he'd just take a good stick, shut up his wife in a room with him, and give her a good cudgelling." The same story is told in Straparola, with so many variations as to show it is no copy. It is also told in a Servian popular tale, with variations of its own, and now here we find it in Borneo, as told by Cole. There was a servant of God who had one wife and one horse, but his wife was one-eyed, and they lived in their house. Now this servant of God understood the language of the beasts of the forest when they spoke, and of the birds of the air when they talked as they flew by. This servant of God also understood the city of the hyena when it arose at night in the forest, and came to the houses and cried near them. So likewise, when the horse was hungry and neighed, he understood why it neighed, and rose up, brought the horse grass, and then returned and sat down. It happened one day that birds had their talk as they were flying by above, and the servant of God understood what they talked. This caused him to laugh, whereupon his wife said to him, What dost thou hear that thou laughest? He replied to his wife, I shall not tell thee what I hear, and why I laugh. The woman said to her husband, I know why thou laughest. Thou laughest at me because I am one-eyed. The man then said to his wife, I saw that thou wast one-eyed before I loved thee, and before we married and sat down in our house. When the woman heard her husband's word, she was quiet. But once at night, as they were lying on the bed, and it was past midnight, it happened that a rat played with his wife on the top of the house, and that both fell to the ground. Then the wife of the rat said to her husband, Thy sport is bad. Thou saidst to me that thou wouldst pay. But when we came together, we fell to the ground, so that I broke my back. When the servant of God heard the talk of the rat's wife, as he was lying on his bed, he laughed. Now, as soon as he laughed, his wife arose, seized him, and said to him as she held him fast, Now this time I will not let thee go out of this house, except thou tell me what thou hearest, and why thou laughest. The man begged the woman, saying, Let me go. But the woman would not listen to her husband's entreaty. The husband then tells his wife that he knows the language of beasts and birds, and she is content. But when he wakes in the morning, he finds he has lost his wonderful gift, and the moral of the tale is added most ungallantly. If a man shows and tells his thoughts to a woman, God will punish him for it, though perhaps it is better for the sake of the gentler sex that the tale should be pointed with unfair moral, than that the African story should proceed like all the other variations, and save the husband's gift at the cost of the wife's skin. Take other African instances. How is it that the wandering Bahunas got their story of the two brothers, the groundwork of which is the same as the Machantabun and the milk-white dew, and where the incidents and even the words are almost the same? How is it that in some of these traits that Bechuana's story has embodied those of that earliest of all popular tales, recently published from an Egyptian papyrus, coeval with the abode of the Israelites in Egypt? And how is it that that same Egyptian tale has other traits which reminds us of the dun bull in Katie Woodenclock, as well as incidents which are the gem of stories long since reduced to writing in Norse sagas of the 12th and 13th centuries? How is it that we still find among the Negroes in the West Indies, a rich story of popular tales, and the bees, epic in full bloom, brought with them from Africa to the islands of the West. And among those tales and traditions, how is it that we find a wishing tree, the counterpart of that in a German popular tale, and a little dirty scrub of a child whom his sister despised, but who is own brother to Boots in the Norse tales, and like him outwits the troll, spoils his substance, and saves his sister? How is it that we find the good woman who washes the loathsome head rewarded, while the bad man who refuses to do that dirty work is punished for his pride? The very groundwork, nay, the very worst that we meet in Bushy Bride, another Norse tale. How is it that we find a Mongolian tale which came confessedly from India, made up of two of our Norse tales, Rich Peter the Pedlar and the giant that had no heart in his body? How should all these things be, and how could they possibly be, except on that theory which day by day becomes more and more of a matter of fact, this, that the whole human race sprung from one stock, planted in the East, which has stretched out its boughs and branches, laden with the fruit of language, and bright with the bloom of song and story, by successive offshoots to the utmost parts of the earth. End of section 4. Recording by Andy Yu, Mississauga, Canada.
Of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Linny. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 5. Introduction, Part 3. Norse Mythology. And now, in the second place, for that particular branch of the Aryan race, in which this peculiar development of the common tradition has arisen, which we are to consider as Norse popular tales. Whatever disputes may have existed as to the mythology of other branches of the Teutonic subdivision of the Aryan race, whatever discussions may have arisen as to the position of this or that divinity among the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, or the Goths, about the Norsemen there can be no dispute or doubt. From a variety of circumstances, but two before all the rest: the one, their settlement in Iceland, which preserved their language and its literary treasures incorrupt; the other, their late conversion to Christianity. Their cosmogony and mythology stands before us in full flower, and we have not, as elsewhere, to pick up and piece together the wretched fragments of a faith, the articles of which its own priests had forgotten to commit to writing, and which those of another creed had dashed to pieces and destroyed wherever their zealous hands could reach. In the two Eddas, therefore, in the early sagas, in Saxo's stilted Latin, which barely conceals the popular songs and legends from which the historians drew his materials, we are enabled to form a perfect conception of the creed of the heathen Norsemen. We are enabled to trace, as has been traced by the same hand in another place, the natural and rational development of that creed, from a simple worship of nature and her powers, first to monotheism, and then to a polytheistic system. The tertiary system of polytheism is the soil out of which the mythology of the Eddas sprang, though, through it, each of the older formations crops out in huge masses which admit of no mistake as to its origin. In the Eddas, the natural powers have been partly subdued, partly thrust on one side, for a time, by Odin and the Aesir, by the Great Father and his children, by one supreme and 12 subordinate gods, who rule for an appointed time, and over whom hangs an impending fate, which imparts a charm of melancholy to this creed, which has clung to the race who once believed in it, long after the creed itself has vanished before the light of Christianity. According to this creed, the Aesir and Odin had their abode in Asgard, a lofty hill in the center of the habitable earth, in the midst of Midgard, that Middle Earth which we hear of in early English poetry, the abode of gods and men. Round that earth, which was fenced in against the attacks of ancient and inveterate foes by a natural fortification of hills, flowed the great sea in a ring, and beyond that sea was Utgard, the outlying world, the abode of frost giants and monsters, those old natural powers who had been dispossessed by Odin and the Aesir when the new order of the universe arose, and between whom and the new gods a feud as inveterate as that cherished by the Titans against Jupiter was necessarily kept alive. It is true, indeed, that this feud was broken by intervals of truce, during which the Aesir and the giants visit each other, and appear on more or less friendly terms. But the true relation between them was war, pretty much as the Norseman was at war with all the rest of the world. Nor was this struggle between two rival races or powers confined to the gods in Asgard alone. Just as their ancient foes were the giants of frost and snow, so between the race of men and the race of trolls was there a perpetual feud. As the gods were men magnified and exaggerated, so were the trolls diminished frost giants, far superior to men in strength and stature, but inferior to men in wit and invention. Like the frost giants, they inhabit the rough and rugged places of the earth, and, historically speaking, in all probability represent the old aboriginal races who retired into the mountainous fastnesses of the land, and whose strength was exaggerated, because the intercourse between the races was so small. In almost every respect, they stand in the same relations to men as the frost giants stand to the gods. There is nothing perhaps more characteristic of a true, as compared with a false religion, than the restlessness of the one when brought face to face with the quiet dignity and majesty of the other. Under the Christian dispensation, our blessed Lord, his awful sacrifice once performed, ascended up on high, having led captivity captive, and expects the hour that shall make his foes his footstool. But false gods, Jupiter, Vishnu, Odin, Thor, must constantly keep themselves, as it were, before the eyes of men, lest they should lose respect. Such gods being invariably what the philosophers call subjective, that is to say, having no existence except in the minds of those who believe in them, having been created by man in his own image with his own desires and passions, stand in constant need of being recreated. They change as the habits and temper of the race which adores them alter. They are ever bound to do something fresh, lest men should forget them, and new divinities usurp their place. Hence came endless avatars in Hindu mythology, reproducing all the dreamy monstrosities of that passive Indian mind. Hence came Jove's adventures, tinged with all the lust and guile which the wickedness of the natural man planted on a hotbed of iniquity is capable of conceiving. Hence bloody Moloch and the foul abominations of Chemosh and Milcom. Hence, too, Odin's countless adventures, his journeys into all parts of the world, his constant trials of wit and strength, when his ancient foes, the frost giants, his hair-breadth escapes. Whence Thor's labours and toils, his passages beyond the sea, girt with his strength-belt, wearing his iron gloves, and grasping his hammer, which split the skulls of so many of the giants' kith and kin. In the Norse gods, then, we see the Norseman himself, sublimed and elevated beyond man's nature, but bearing about with him all his bravery and endurance, all his dash and spirit of adventure, all his fortitude and resolution to struggle against a certainty of doom which, sooner or later, must overtake him on that dread day, the twilight of the gods, when the wolf was to break loose, when the great snake that lay coiled round the world should lash himself into wrath, and the whole race of the Aesires and their antagonists were to perish in internecine strife. Such were the gods in whom the Norseman believed, exaggerations of himself, of all his good and all his bad qualities. Their might and their adventures, their domestic quarrels and certain doom, were sung in venerable lays, now collected in what we call the Elder or Poetic Edda, simple majestic songs whose mellow accents go straight to the heart through the ear, and whose simple severity never suffers us to mistake their meaning. But besides these gods, there were heroes of the race whose fame and glory were in every man's memory, and whose mighty deeds were in every minstrel's mouth: Helgi, Sigmund, Sinfjötli, Sigurd, Signy, Brynhild, Gudrun, champions and shield maidens, henchmen and course choosers, now dead and gone, who sat round Odin's board in Valhalla; women whose beauty, woes, and sufferings were beyond those of all women; men whose prowess had never found an equal. Between these, love and hate, all that can foster passion or beget revenge. Ill-assorted marriages, the right man to the wrong woman, the wrong man to the right woman, envyings, jealousies, hatred, murders, all the works of the natural man, combined together to form that marvelous story which begins with a curse, the curse of ill-gotten gold, and ends with a curse, a widow's curse, which drags down all on whom it falls, and even her own flesh and blood, to certain doom. Such was the theme of the wondrous Volsung tale, the far older, simpler, and grander original of that Nibelungen Need of the 13th century, a tale which begins with the slaughter of Fafnir by Sigurd, and ends with Hermaneric, that fierce faith breaker, as the Anglo-Saxon minstrel calls him, when he is describing, in rapid touches, the mythic glories of the Teutonic race. This was the story of the Volsungs. They traced themselves back, like all heroes, to Odin, the great father of gods and men. From him sprung Sigi, from him Rerir, from him Volsung, ripped from his mother's womb after a 6 years' bearing, to become the eponymous of that famous race. In the center of his hall grew an oak, the tall trunk of which passed through the roof, and its boughs spread far and wide in upper air. Into that hall, on a high feast day, when Signy, Volsung's daughter, was to be given away to Sigurd, king of Gothland, strolled an old one-eyed guest. His feet were bare, his hose were of knitted linen, he wore a great striped cloak, and a broad flapping hat. In his hand he bore a sword, which, at one stroke, he drove up to the hilt in the oak trunk. "There," said he, "let him of all this company bear this sword who is man enough to pull it out. I give it him, and none shall say he ever bore a better blade." With these words he passed out of the hall, and was seen no more. Many tried, for that sword was plainly a thing of price, but none could stir it, till Sigmund, the best and bravest of Volsung's sons, tried his hands, and lo, the weapon yielded itself at once. This was that famous blade, Gram, of which we shall hear again. Sigmund bore it in battle against his brother-in-law, who quarrelled with him about this very sword, when Volsung fell, and Sigmund and his 10 brothers were taken and bound. All perished but Sigmund, who was saved by his sister Signy, and hidden in a wood till he could revenge his father and brethren. Here with Sinfjötli, who was at once his son and nephew, he ran as a werewolf through the forest, and wrought many wild deeds. When Sinfjötli was of age to help him, they proceeded to vengeance, and burned the treacherous brother-in-law alive, with all his followers. Sigmund then regains his father's kingdom, and in extreme old age dies in battle against the sons of King Hunding. Just as he was about to turn the fight, a warrior of more than mortal might, a one-eyed man in a blue cloak, with a flapping hat, rose up against him, spear in hand. At that outstretched spear Sigmund smites with his trusty sword. It snaps in twain. Then he knows that his luck's gone. He sees in his foe Odin, the giver of the sword, sinks down on the gory battlefield, and dies in the arms of Hjordis, his young wife, refusing all leechcraft and bowing his head to Odin's will. By the fortune of war, Hjordis, bearing a babe under her girdle, came into the hands of King Hjelprek of Denmark, There she bore a son to Sigurd, the darling of Teutonic song and story. Regin, the king's smith, was his foster father, and as the boy grew up, the fairest and stoutest of all the Volsungs, Regin, who was of the dwarf race, urged him day by day to do a doughty deed and slay Fafnir the dragon. For Fafnir, Regin, and Ottar had been brothers, sons of Hreidmar. In one of their many wanderings, Odin, Loki, and Heinir came to a river and a forge. There, on the bank under the forge, they saw an otter with a salmon in its mouth, which it ate greedily with its eyes shut. Loki took a stone, threw it, and killed the beast, and boasted how he had got both fish and flesh at one throw. Then the Aesir passed on and came at night to Hreidmar's house, asked the lodging, got it, and showed their spoil. "Seize and bind them, lads," cried Hreidmar, "for they have slain your brother Ottar." So they were seized and bound by Regin and Fafnir, and offered an atonement to buy off the feud, and Hreidmar was to name the sum. Then Ottar was flayed, and the Aesir were to fill the skin with red gold, and cover it without, that not a hair could be seen. To fetch the gold, Odin sent Loki down to the abodes of the Black Elves. There, in a stream, he caught Andvari, the dwarf, and made him give up all the gold which he had hoarded up in the stony rock. In vain the dwarf begged and prayed that he might keep one ring, for it was the source of all his wealth, and ring after ring dropped from it. "No, not a penny should he have," said Loki. Then the dwarf laid a curse on the ring, and said it should be every man's bane who owned it. "So much the better," said Loki, and when he got back, Odin saw the ring, how fair it was, and kept it to himself, but gave the gold to Hreidmar. So Hreidmar filled the skin with gold, as full as he could, and set it up on end, and Odin poured gold over it, and covered it up. But when Hreidmar looked at it, he saw still one grey hair, and bade them cover that too, else the atonement was at an end. Then Odin drew forth the ring, and laid it over the grey hair. So the Aesir was set free, but before they went, Loki repeated the curse which Andvari had laid upon the ring and gold. It soon began to work. First Regin asked for some of the gold, but not a penny would Hreidmar give. So the two brothers laid their heads together and slew their sire. Then Regin begged Fafnir to share the gold with him, but no, Fafnir was stronger and said he should keep it all himself. And Regin had best be off unless he wished to fare the same way as Hreidmar. So Regin had to fly, but Fafnir took a dragon's shape. "And there," said Regin, "he lies on the glistening heath, coiled round his store of gold and precious things, and that's why I wish you to kill him." Sigurd told Regin, who was the best of smiths, to forge him a sword. Two are made, but both snap asunder at the first stroke. "Untrue are they like you and all your race," cries Sigurd. Then he went to his mother and begged the broken bits of grum. And out of them Regin forged a new blade, that clove the anvil in the smithy, and cut a lock of wool borne down upon it by a running stream. "Now slay me Fafnir," said Regin. But Sigurd must first find out King Hunding's sons, and avenge his father Sigmund's death. King Hjalprek lends him force. By Odin's guidance he finds them out, rouses their army, and slays all those brothers. On his return, his foster father still eggs him on to slay the dragon, and thus to shew that there was still a Volsung left. So, armed with Grum, and mounted on Gran, his good steed, whom Odin had taught him how to choose, Sigurd rode to the glistening heath, dug a pit in the dragon's path, and slew him as he passed over him down to drink at the river. Then Regin came up, and the old feeling of vengeance for a brother's blood grew stronger, and, as an atonement, Sigurd was to roast Fafnir's heart and carry it to Regin, who swilled his fill of the dragon's blood and lay down to sleep. But as Sigurd roasted the heart, and wondered if it would soon be done, he tried it with his finger to see if it were soft. The hot roast burned his finger, and he put it into his mouth, and tasted the life-blood of the dragon. Then, in a moment, he understood the song of birds, and heard how the swallows over his head said one to the other, "There thou sittest, Sigurd, roasting Fafnir's heart. Eat it thyself, and become the wisest of men." Then another said, "There lies Regin, and means to cheat him who trusts him." Then a third said, "Let Sigurd cut off his head then, and so own all the gold himself." Then Sigurd went to Regin, and slew him, and ate the heart, and rode on Gran to Fafnir's lair, and took the spoil, and loaded his good steed with it, and rode away. And now Sigurd was the most famous of men. All the songs and stories of the North made him the darling of that age. They dwell on his soft hair, which fell in great locks of golden brown, on his bushy beard of auburn hue, his straight features, his ruddy cheeks, his broad brow, his bright and piercing eye, of which few dare to meet the gaze, his dapper limbs and well-knit joints, his broad shoulders and towering height. So tall he was, that as he strode through the full-grown rye, girt with gram, the tip of the scabbard just touched the ears of corn. Ready of tongue too, and full of forethought. His great pleasure was to help other men and to do daring deeds, to spoil his foes and give largely to his friends, the bravest man alive, and one that never knew fear. On and on he rode, till on a lone fell he saw a flickering flame, and when he reached it, there it flamed and blazed all round the house. No horse but Gran could ride that flame, no man alive but Sigurd sit him while he leaped through it. Inside the house lay a fair maiden, armed from head to foot, in a deep sleep. Brynhild, Atli's sister, was her name, a Valkyrie, a course-chooser. But out of wilfulness she had given the victory to the wrong side, and Odin in his wrath had thrust the horn of sleep into her cloak, and laid her under a curse, to slumber there, till a man bold enough to ride through that flame came to set her free, and win her for his bride. So then she woke up, and taught him all runes and wisdom, and they swore to love each other with a mighty oath, and then Sigurd left her and rode on. So on he rode to King Giuki's hall, Giuki the Niflung, king of Frankland, whose wife was Grimhild, whose sons were Gunnar and Hogni, whose stepson was Guttorm, and whose daughter was the fair Gudrun. Here at first he was full of Brynhild, and all for going back to fetch his lovely bride from the lone fell. But Grimhild was given to dark arts. She longed for the brave Volsung for her own daughter. She brewed him the philtre of forgetfulness. He drained it off, forgot Brynhild, swore a brother's friendship with Gunnar and Hogni, and wedded the fair Gudrun. But now Giuki wanted a wife for Gunnar, and so off sat the brothers and their bosom friend to woo, but whom should they choose but Brynhild, Atli's sister, who sat there still upon the fell, waiting for the man who was bold enough to ride through the flickering flame. She knew but one could do it, and waited for that one to come back. So she had given out whoever could ride that flame should have her to wife. So when Gunnar and Hogni reached it, Gunnar rode at it, but his horse, good though it was, swerved from the fierce flame. Then, by Grimhild's magic arts, Sigurd and Gunnar changed shapes and arms, and Sigurd leapt up on Gren's back, and the good steed bore him bravely through the flame. So Brynhild, the proud maiden, was won and forced to yield. That evening was their wedding, but when they lay down to rest, Sigurd unsheathed his keen sword, Grum, and laid it naked between them. Next morning, when he arose, he took the ring which Andvari had laid under the curse, and which was among Fafnir's treasures, and gave it to Brynhild as a morning gift, and she gave him another ring as a pledge. Then Sigurd rode back to his companions and took his own shape again, and then Gunnar went and claimed Brynhild and carried her home as his bride. But no sooner was Gunnar wedded than Sigurd's eyes were opened, and the power of the philtre passed away. He remembered all that had passed, and the oath he had sworn to Brynhild. All this came back upon him when it was too late, but he was wise and said nothing about it. Well, so things went on, till one day Brynhild and Gudrun went down to the river to wash their hair. Then Brynhild waded out into the stream as far as she could, and said she wouldn't have on her head the water that streamed from Gudrun's, for hers was the braver husband. So Gudrun waded out after her and said the water ought to come on her hair first, because her husband bore away the palm for Gunnar, and every other man alive, for he slew Fafnir and Regin and took their inheritance. Aye, said Brynhild, but it was a worthier deed when Gunnar rode through the flame, but Sigurd dared not try. Then Gudrun laughed and said, think'st thou that Gunnar really rode the flame? I trow he went to bed with thee that night, who gave me this gold ring. And as for that ring yonder, which you have on your finger, and which you got as your morning gift, its name is Andvari's spoil, and that I don't think Gunnar saw it on the glistening heath." Then Brynhild held her peace and went home, and her love for Sigurd came back, but it was turned to hate, for she felt herself betrayed. Then she egged on Gunnar to revenge her wrong. At last the brother yielded to her entreaties, but they were sworn brothers to Sigurd, and to break that oath by deed was a thing unheard of. Still they broke it in spirit. By charms and prayers they set on Guttorm, their half-brother, and so, at dead of night, while Gudrun held the bravest man alive fast locked in her white arms, the murderers stole to the bedside and drove a sword through the hero. Then Sigurd turned and writhed, and as Guttorm fled he hurled Gram after him, and the keen blade took him asunder at the waist, and his head fell out of the room, and his heels in, and that was the end of Guttorm. But with revenge Brynhild's love returned, and when Sigurd was laid upon the pile her heart broke. She burst forth into a prophetic song of the woes that were still to come, made them lay her by his side with Gram between them, and so went to Valhalla with her old lover. Thus Andvari's curse was fulfilled. Gudrun, the weary widow, wandered away. After a while she accepts atonements from her brothers for her husband's loss, and marries Atli, the Hun King, Brynhild's brother. He cherished a grudge against Yuki's sons for the guile they had practiced against their brother-in-law, which had broken his sister's heart, and besides, he claimed, in right of Gudrun, all the gold which Sigurd won from the dragon, but which the Niflung princess had seized when he was slain. It was in vain to attack them in fair fight, so he sent them a friendly message and invited them to a banquet. They go and are overpowered. Hogni's heart is cut out of him alive, but he still smiles. Gunnar is cast into a pit full of snakes, but even then charms them to sleep with his harp, all but one, that flies at his heart and stings him to death. With them perished the secret of the dragon's hoard, which they had thrown into the Rhine as they crossed it on the way to Hunland. Now comes horror on horror. Revenge for her brothers now belongs to Gudrun. She slays with her own hand her 2 sons by Atli, makes him eat their flesh and drink their blood out of their skulls, and, while the king slept sound, slew him in his bed by the help of her brother, Hogni's son. Then she set the hall ablaze and burnt all that were in it. After that she went to the seashore and threw herself in to drown. But the deep will not have her. The billows bear her over to King Jonakr's land. He marries her, and has 3 sons by her, Sarli, Hamdir, and Erp, black-haired as ravens, like all the Niflungs. Svanhild, her daughter by Sigurd, who had her father's bright and terrible eyes, she has still with her, now grown up to be the fairest of women. So, when Hermanaric the Mighty, the great Gothic king, heard of Svanhild's beauty, he sent his son Randver to woo her for him. But Bikki the false said to the youth, "Better far were this maiden for thee than for thy old father." And the maiden and the prince thought it good advice. Then Bikki went and told the king, and Hermanaric bade them take and hang Randver at once. So, on his way to the gallows, the prince took his hawk and plucked off all its feathers and sent it to his father. But when his sire saw it, he knew at once that, as the hawk was featherless and unable to fly, so was his realm defenseless under an old and sonless king. Too late he sent to stop the hanging. His son was already dead. So one day, as he rode back from hunting, he saw fair Svanhild washing her golden locks. And it came into his heart how there she sat, the cause of all his woe. And he and his men rode at her and over her, and their steeds trampled her to death. But when Gudrun heard this, she set on her 3 Niflung sons to avenge their sister. Byrnies and helms she gave them, so true that no sword would bite on them. They were to steal on Hermanaric as he slept. Sarli was to cut off his hands, Hamdir his feet, and Erp his head. So, as the 3 went along, the 2 asked Erp what help he would give them when they got to Hermanaric. "Such as hand lends to foot," he said. "No help at all," they cried. and passing from words to blows, and because their mother loved Erp best, they slew him. A little further on Sorley stumbled and fell forward, but saved himself with one hand, and said, "Here hand helps foot. Better were it that Erp lived." So they came on Hermaneric as he slept, and Sorley hewed off his hand, and Hamdir his feet, but he awoke and called for his men. Then said Hamdir, "Were Erp alive, the head would be off, and he couldn't call out." Then Hermaneric's men arose and took the twain, and when they found that no steel would touch them, an old one-eyed man gave them advice to stone them to death. Thus fell Sorley and Hamdir, and soon after Gudrun died too, and with her ends the Volsung and the Niflung tale. And here it is worthwhile to say, since some minds are so narrowly molded as to be incapable of containing more than one idea, that because it has seemed a duty to describe in its true light the old faith of our forefathers, it by no means follows that the same eyes are blind to the glorious beauty of Greek mythology. That had the rare advantage of running its course free and unfettered until it fell rather by natural decay than before the weapon of a new belief. The Greeks were atheists before they became Christian. Their faith had passed through every stage. We can contemplate it as it springs out of the dim misshapen symbol, during that phase when men's eyes are fixed more on meaning and reality than on beauty and form. We can mark how it gradually looks more to symmetry and shape, how it is transfigured in the arts, until, under that pure air and bright sky, the glowing radiant figures of Apollo and Aphrodite, of Zeus and Athene, of perfect man worship and woman worship, stand out clear and round in the foreground against the misted distance of ancient times. Out of that misted distance the Norseman's faith never emerged. What that early phase of faith might have become, had it been once wedded to the Muses and learned to cultivate the arts, it is impossible to say. As it is, its career was cut short in mid-course. It carried about with it that melancholy presentiment of dissolution which has come to be so characteristic of modern life, but of which scarce a trace exists in ancient times, and this feeling would always have made it different from that cheerful carelessness which so attracts us in the Greeks. But even that downcast, brooding heart was capable of conceiving great and heroic thoughts, which it might have clothed in noble shapes and forms, had not the axe of Providence cut down the stately sapling in the north before it grew to be a tree, while it spared the pines of Delphi and Dodona's sacred oaks until they had attained a green old age. And so this faith remained rude and rough, but even rudeness has a simplicity of its own, and it's better to be rough and true-hearted than polished and false. In all the feelings of natural affection, that faith need fear no comparison with any other upon earth. In these respects it is firm and steadfast as a rock, and pure and bright as a living spring. The highest God is a father who protects his children, who gives them glory and victory while they live, and when they die, takes them to himself. To those fatherly abodes death was a happy return, a glorious going home. By the side of this great father stands a venerable goddess, dazzling with beauty, the great mother of gods and men. Hand in hand this divine pair traverse the land, he teaching the men the use of arms and all the arts of war, for war was then as now a noble calling, and to handle arms an honorable, nay necessary, profession. To the women she teaches domestic duties and the arts of peace. From her they learn to weave and sew and spin. From her too the husbandman learns to till his fields. From him springs poetry and song, from her legend and tradition. Nor should it ever be forgotten that the footsteps of Providence are always onward, even when they seem taken in the dark, and that their rude faith was the first in which that veneration for woman arose, which the Western nations may well claim as the brightest jewel in their crown of civilization. That while she was a slave in the East, a toy to the Greeks, and a housewife to the Romans, she was a helpmeet to the Teuton, and that those stern warriors recognized something divine in her nature and bowed before her clearer insight into heavenly mysteries. The worship of the Virgin Mary was gradually developed out of this conception of woman's character, and would have been a thing absurd and impossible had Christianity clung forever to Eastern soil. And now to proceed, after thus turning aside, to compare the mythology of the Greek with the faith of the Norseman. The mistake is to favor one or the other exclusively, instead of respecting and admiring both. But it is a mistake which those only can fall into whose souls are narrow and confined, who would say this thing and this person you shall love and none other, this form and feature you shall worship and adore, and this alone, when in fact the whole promised land of thought and life lies before us at our feet. Our nature encourages us to go in and possess it, and every step we make in this new world of knowledge brings us to fresh prospects of beauty and to new pastures of delight. Such were the gods, and such the heroes of the Norsemen, who, like his own gods, went smiling to death under the weight of an inevitable destiny. But that fate never fell on their gods. Before this subjective mythological dream of the Norsemen could be fulfilled, the religious mist in which they walked was scattered by the sunbeams of Christianity. A new state and condition of society arose, and the creed which had satisfied the race of heathen warriors, who externally were at war with all the world, became in time an object of horror and aversion to the converted Christian. This is not the place to describe the long struggle between the new and the old faith in the North, how kings and queens became the foster fathers and nursing mothers of the Church, how the great chiefs, each a little king in himself, scorned and derided the whole scheme as altogether weak and effeminate, how the bulk of the people were sullen and suspicious, and often broke out into heathen mutiny, how kings rose and kings fell, just as they took one or the other side, and how finally, after a contest which had lasted altogether more than 3 centuries, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Sweden, we run them over in the ardor of conversion, became faithful to Christianity, as preached by the missionaries of the Church of Rome. One fact, however, we must insist on, which might be inferred, indeed, both from the nature of the struggle itself and the character of Rome, and that is, that, throughout, there was something in the process of conversion of the nature of a compromise, of what we may call the great principle of give and take. In all Christian churches, indeed, and in none so much as the Church of Rome, nothing is so austere, so elevating, and so grand as the uncompromising tone in which the great dogmas of the faith are enunciated and proclaimed. Nothing is more magnificent, in short, than the theory of Christianity. But nothing is more mean and miserable than the time-serving way in which those dogmas are dragged down to the dull level of daily life, and that sublime theory reduced to ordinary practice. At Rome, it was true that the Pope could congratulate the faithful that whole nations in the barbarous and frozen north had been added to the true fold, and that Odin's grim champions now universally believed in the gospel of peace and love. It is so easy to dispose of a doubtful struggle in a single sentence, and so tempting to believe it when once written. But in the North, the state of things and the manner of proceeding were entirely different. There, the dogma was proclaimed, indeed, but the manner of preaching it was not in that mild spirit with which the Saviour rebuked the disciple when he said, "Put up again thy sword into his place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." There, the sword was used to bring converts to the font, and the baptism was often one rather of blood than of water. There, the new converts perpetually relapsed, chased away the missionaries and the kings who sheltered them, and only yielded at last to the overwhelming weight of Christian opinion in the Western world. St. Olaf, king and martyr, martyred in pitched battle by his mutinous Elodial freemen, because he tried to drive rather than to lead them to the cross. And another Olaf, greater than he, Olaf Tryggvason, who fell in battle against the heathen Swedes, were men of blood rather than peace, but to them the introduction of the new faith into Norway is mainly owing. So also Charlemagne, at an earlier period, had dealt with the Saxons at the main bridge, when his ultimatum was Christianity or death. So also the first missionary to Iceland, who met indeed with a sorry reception, was followed about by a stout champion named Thangbrand, who, whenever there was what we should now call a missionary meeting, challenged any impugner of the new doctrines to mortal combat on the spot. No wonder that, after having killed several opponents in the little tour which he made with his missionary friend through the island, it became too hot to hold him, and he and the missionary and the new creed were forced to take ship and sail back to Norway. Precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little and there a little, was the motto of Rome in her dealings with the heathen Norsemen. And if she suited herself at first rather to their habits and temper than to those of more enlightened nations, she had an excuse in St. Paul's maxim of making herself all things to all men. Thus, when a second attempt to Christianize Iceland proved more successful, for in the meantime King Olaf Tryggvason, a zealous Christian, has seized as hostages all the Icelanders of family and fame who happened to be in Norway, and thus worked on the feelings of the chiefs of those families at home, who in their turn bribed the lawmen who presided over the great assembly to pronounce in favor of the new faith. Even then the adherents of the old religion were allowed to perform its rites in secret, and two old heathen practices only were expressly prohibited: the exposure of infants and the eating of horse-flesh, for horses were sacred animals, and the heathen ate their flesh after they had been solemnly sacrificed to the gods. As a matter of fact, it is far easier to change a form of religion than to extirpate a faith. The first, indeed, is no easy matter, as those students of history well know who are acquainted with the tenacity with which a large proportion of the English nation clung to the Church of Rome long after the state had declared for the Reformation. But to change the faith of a whole nation in block and bulk on the instant was a thing contrary to the ordinary working of Providence, and unknown even in the days of miracles, though the days of miracles had long ceased when Rome advanced against the north. There it was more politic to raise a cross in the grove where the sacred tree had once stood, and to point to the sacred emblem which had supplanted the old object of national adoration when the populace came at certain seasons with songs and dances to perform their heathen rites. Near the cross soon rose a church, and both were girt by a cemetery, the soil of which was doubly sacred as a heathen fane and a Christian sanctuary, and where alone the bodies of the faithful could repose in peace. But the songs and dances and processions in the churchyard round the cross continued long after Christianity had become dominant. So also the worship of wells and springs was Christianized when it was found impossible to prevent it. Great churches arose over or near them, as at Walsingham, where an abbey, the holiest place in England, after the shrine of St. Thomas at Canterbury, threw its majestic shade over the heathen wishing well, and the worshippers of Odin in the Norner were gradually converted into votaries of the Virgin Mary. Such practices form a subject of constant remonstrance and reproof in the treatises and penitential epistles of medieval divines, and in some few places and churches, even in England, such rites are still yearly celebrated. So, too, again with the ancient gods. They were cast down from honor, but not from power. They lost their genial kindly influence as the protectors of men and the origin of all things good, but their existence was tolerated. They became powerful for ill, and degenerated into malignant demons. Thus the worshippers of Odin had supposed that at certain times and rare intervals the good powers shewed themselves in bodily shape to mortal eye, passing through the land in divine progress, bringing blessings in their train, and receiving in return the offerings and homage of their grateful votaries. But these were naturally only exceptional instances. On ordinary occasions the pious heathen recognized his gods sweeping through the air in cloud and storm, riding on the wings of the wind, and speaking in awful accents as the tempest howled and roared, and the sea shook his white mane and crest. Nor did he fail to see them in the dust and din of battle, when Odin appeared with his terrible helm, succoring his own, striking fear into their foes, and turning the day in many a doubtful fight, or in the hurry and uproar of the chase, where the mighty huntsman on his swift steed, seen in glimpses among the trees, took up the hunt where weary mortals let it down, outstripped them all, and brought the noble quarry to the ground. Looking up to the stars in heaven, they saw the footsteps of the gods marked out in the bright path of the Milky Way, and in the bear they hailed the war chariot of the warrior's god. The great goddesses, too, Frigga and Freya, were thoroughly old-fashioned domestic divinities. They help women in their greatest need. They spin themselves, they teach the maids to spin, and punish them if the wool remains upon their spindle. They are kind and good and bright, for Holda, Bertha, are the epithets given to them. and so too this mythology which, in its aspect to the stranger and the external world, was so ruthless and terrible, when looked at from within and at home, was genial and kindly and hearty, and affords another proof that men, in all ages and climes, are not so bad as they seem; that after all, peace and not war is the proper state for man, and that a nation may make war on others and exist, but that unless it has peace within and industry at home, it must perish from the face of the earth. But when Christianity came, the whole character of this goodly array of divinities was soured and spoiled. Instead of the stately procession of the god, which the intensely sensuous eye of man in that early time connected with all the phenomena of nature, the people were led to believe in a ghastly, grisly band of ghosts who followed an infernal warrior or huntsman in hideous tumult through the midnight air. No doubt, as Grimm rightly remarks, the heathen had fondly fancied that the spirits of those who had gone to Odin followed him in his triumphant progress, either visibly or invisibly; that they rode with him in the whirlwind, just as they followed him to battle, and feasted with him in Valhalla. But now the Christian belief, when it had degraded the mighty god into a demon huntsman who pursued his nightly round in chase of human souls, saw, in the train of the infernal master of the hunt, only the spectres of suicides, drunkards, and ruffians. And, with all the uncharitableness of a dogmatic faith, the spirits of children who died unbaptized, whose hard fate had thrown them into such evil company. This was the way in which that widespread superstition arose, which sees in the phantoms of the clouds the shapes of the wild huntsman and his accursed crew, and hears, in spring and autumn nights, when sea-fowl take the wing to fly either south or north, the strange accents and uncouth yells with which the chase is pressed on in upper air. Thus, in Sweden it is still Odin who passes by; in Denmark it is King Waldemar's hunt; in Norway it is Askerida, that is, Asgard's car; in Germany it is Wode, Woden, or Hakelberend, or Dietrich of Bern; in France it is Hellequin, or King Hugo, or Charles V, or, dropping a name altogether, it is Le Grand Veneur, who ranges at night through the forest of Fontainebleau. Nor was England without her wild huntsman and his ghastly following. Gervase of Tilbury, in the 12th century, could tell it of King Arthur, round whose mighty name the superstition settled itself, for he had heard from the foresters how, on alternate days about the full of the moon, one day at noon, the next at midnight when the moon shone bright, a mighty train of hunters on horses was seen, with baying hounds and blast of horns. And when those hunters were asked of whose company and household they were, they replied, of Arthur's. We hear of him again in the Complaint of Scotland, that curious composition attributed by some to Sir David Lindsay of the Mount in Fife, and of Gilmerton in East Lothian, where he says, Arthur Knight he rade on night, with gilded spur and candle light. Nor should we forget, when considering this legend, that story of Herne the Hunter, who, sometime a keeper here in Windsor Forest, doth all the winter time at still midnight walk round about an oak with great ragged horns, and there he blasts the trees and takes the cattle, and makes milk kine yield blood and shakes a chain, in a most hideous and dreadful manner. Merry Wives of Windsor, Act 4, Scene 4. And even yet, in various parts of England, the story of some great man, generally a member of one of the county families, who drives about the country at night, is common. Thus, in Warwickshire, it is the one-handed Boughton, who drives about in his coach and six, and makes the benighted traveller hold gates open for him; or it is Lady Skipwith, who passes through the country at night in the same manner. This subject might be pursued to much greater length, for popular tradition is full of such stories. But enough has been said to show how the awful presence of a glorious God can be converted into a gloomy superstition, and, at the same time, how the majesty of the old belief strives to rescue itself by clinging, in the popular consciousness, to some king or hero, as Arthur or Waldemar, or failing that, to some squire's family, as Hakelberend or the one-handed Boughton, or even to the keeper Herne. Odin and the Aesir, then, were dispossessed and degraded by our Saviour and his apostles, just as they had of old thrown out the frost giants, and the two are mingled together in medieval Norse tradition, as trolls and giants, hostile alike to Christianity and men. Christianity had taken possession indeed, but it was beyond her power to kill. To this half result the swift corruption of the Church of Rome lent no small aid. Her doctrines, as taught by Augustine and Boniface, by Anchor and Siegfried, were comparatively mild and pure. But she had scarce swallowed the heathendom of the north, much in the same way as the wolf was to swallow Odin at the twilight of the gods, then she fell into a deadly lethargy of faith, which put it out of her powers to digest her meal. Gregory VII, elected pope in 1073, tore the clergy from the ties of domestic life with a grasp that wounded every fibre of natural affection and made it bleed to the very root. With the celibacy of the clergy he established the hierarchy of the Church, but her labors as a missionary church were over. Henceforth she worked not by missionaries and apostles, but by crusaders and bulls. Now she raised mighty armaments to recover the barren soil of the Holy Sepulchre, or to annihilate heretic Albigenses. Now she established great orders, Templars and Hospitallers, whose pride in luxury and pomp brought swift destruction on one at least of those fraternities. Now she became feudal. She owned land instead of hearts, and forgot that the true patrimony of St. Peter was the souls of men. No wonder that, with the barbarism of the times, she soon fulfilled the apostle's words, "She that liveth in luxury is dead while she liveth," and became filled with idle superstitions and vain beliefs. No wonder, then, that instead of completing her conquest over the heathen and carrying out their conversion, she became half heathen herself, that she adopted the tales and traditions of the old mythology, which she had never been able to extirpate, and related them of our Lord and his apostles. No wonder, then, that having abandoned her mission of being the first power of intelligence on earth, she fell like Lucifer when the mist of medieval feudalism rolled away, and the light of learning and education returned, fell before the indignation of enlightened men working upon popular opinion. Since which day, though she has changed her plans and remodeled her superstitions to suit the times, she has never regained the supremacy which, if she had been wise in a true sense, she seemed destined to hold forever. End of section 5.